I finally had some time to sit down and play through the character stories in Arknights Endfield, and the first one I tried was Leviathan's. Going in, I thought I had a pretty clear idea of what her story was going to be. I thought I knew the tone it would take, what kind of role she'd play, and what the game would probably try to highlight about her. I was also a little skeptical that I was even going to like it. From the start, it was pretty clear that the story was going to lean heavily on memory loss, and that's one of those things I'm usually not a big fan of, especially in gacha stories. It's such a common setup for this protagonist that it ends up feeling like a shortcut rather than something meaningful. So I went in expecting something fairly similar, and almost none of that ended up being true. What surprised me instead was how simple the story was, simple in a very intentional way, and by the time it was over, that simplicity had completely changed how I was looking at Leviathan as a character. Now let's get the boring stuff out of the way first and talk about structure. In gacha games, regardless of whether we're talking about main story chapters, side stories or character stories, there's a pretty common problem. They tend to get very wordy, often needlessly so. Obviously, there are exceptions, some stories manage their length really well, but if you look at the gacha storytelling as a whole, you're far more likely to run into moments where the story overstays its welcome, where scenes drag on longer than they need to, or where the pacing starts to work against the experience instead of supporting it. That's one of the things that immediately surprised me about Leviathan's story. It was short, unexpectedly short, and more importantly, it felt very deliberate about that. The story didn't try to stretch itself into something bigger than it needed to be, and it didn't pad itself out just to feel substantial. On top of that, the pacing was genuinely well handled. This isn't the kind of gripping, high-tension story that keeps you on the edge of your seat, where you're constantly waiting for the next dramatic turn. It's much quieter than that. And yet I still went through it smoothly, almost without noticing the time passing. At the same time, at some point it just ended. It simply reached its conclusion at the right moment, and that felt good. What they really highlighted for me is how much good structure and pacing matter on their own. You don't actually need constant escalation or dramatic tension to stay engaged. Sometimes a simple story told with a restraint and clear sense of when to stop is more than enough to pull you in. Leviathan's story doesn't try to be gripping in the traditional sense, but because it understands its own scope and doesn't overstay its welcome, it ends up being quietly immersive anyway. Now let's talk about Leviathan's story itself and what it's actually about. On the surface, it's very simple. We met Leviathan as a character who's searching for her lost memories, or rather for her original self's lost memories. And since the protagonist is dealing with something similar, the two of them end up going on this journey together, trying to understand who they were and what they've lost. This is exactly the point where my expectations kicked in, and honestly, where I expected the story to start going in a very familiar direction. With how often amnesia shows up in gacha narratives, especially with protagonists, I was fully prepared for the story to lean hard into over-dramatization. That's usually how these stories go. A relatively simple situation gets inflated into something much bigger than it needs to be. Every missing memory becomes a source of constant anguish. Every revelation is treated like a major emotional explosion. The story keeps insisting that recovering the past is the only thing that matters. But that's not what happens here. As the story unfolds, we learn more about Leviathan's nature, that she's a reconvener, essentially a continuation or a recreation of an original individual, and with that comes an inherited problem, the absence of memories that once defined someone else's life. What really caught me off guard is how the story handles the original Leviathan's response to that loss. Instead of framing it as a tragedy that needs to be undone, the original chose something much quieter. Rather than obsessively searching for what was missing, she chose to move forward, to live, to experience the world as it is now, and to create new memories instead of chasing old ones. And that choice echoes forward. When the current Leviathan learns how the original handled her situation, it doesn't trigger some dramatic breakdown or desperate reversal. With the help of the protagonist, she comes to the same conclusion. She chooses not to pursue her missing memories, not because they don't matter, but because they don't have to define her future. That's the part that genuinely surprised me. I was expecting the story to escalate, to turn this into a big emotional confrontation, or to push Leviathan toward reclaiming a past she never truly lived. Instead, it ends in a very grounded place. Leviathan decides to stay, to build a new life, to make new memories alongside the protagonist, the crew, and the people in the world. In a setting as large and dramatic as Endfield, a sprawling world with massive stakes and constant tension, this kind of resolution feels almost unexpected, not because it's small, but because it's restrained. The story doesn't try to convince you that this choice is tragic or heroic, it just treats it as human. And that restraint is exactly what makes it feel refreshing. Rather than forcing emotional weight through dramatization, the story trusts the choice itself to carry meaning. So once I realized that the story wasn't trying to overcomplicate itself, what really stood out to me was how much of that restraint comes from the characters themselves, especially Leviathan, but also the protagonist. Because a lot of what makes this story work isn't just the structure or the ending, it's the way these two characters are written and how differently they behave compared to what I was expecting going in. Let's start with the protagonist, because if you've watched my channel for a while, you already know I'm not a big fan of self-insert or even semi-self-insert gacha protagonists. And I know some people might disagree with calling the Enfield protagonist a self-insert, but to some degree, they kind of are. That's just the nature of these games. They're designed to let the player project themselves onto the character. That's exactly why I was pleasantly surprised that Leviathan's story actually gives the protagonist some development. It's not anything dramatic or some huge revelation. We don't suddenly learn everything about their past. In fact, I'm not even sure how much of what's hinted at fully landed for me. And that might be because I'm missing context from the previous game. There are pieces there, but they're not fully explained. What is clear though is the protagonist's insecurity. There's this underlying anxiety about their lost memories, about not being able to live up to the expectations tied to their previous self, and about potentially letting down the people around them who still see them as that person. And I like that the story didn't try to rush past that. Those insecurities aren't magically resolved, they're just acknowledged, and they quietly sit in the background as Leviathan's story unfolds, which brings us to Leviathan herself, because she turned out to be a very different character from what I was expecting. Going in, I assumed she'd be colder, more edgy, maybe a bit arrogant, distant, unsociable, the kind of character who's defined almost entirely by loss and mystery. But Leviathan just isn't that. She's surprisingly down to earth, she's curious, a little awkward, and genuinely funny at times. She doesn't constantly dwell on what she's lost, and she isn't written as this tragic figure who needs to be fixed or saved. I think this comes through most clearly in the decision she makes at the end of the story, choosing to let go of her original self's memory and build a new life instead. What stood out to me wasn't just the choice itself, but how refreshingly quick she was to make it. And I don't mean that in a rushed or careless way, because this kind of moment could absolutely be written poorly. Here though, it feels like a very honest expression of who she is. It doesn't feel like Leviathan is suddenly convinced by a speech or pushed into a decision by the protagonist. It feels like she's already been thinking about this, and once she understands how the original handled the same situation, the answer simply becomes clear. That choice also reflects back onto the protagonist. Rather than trying to fix Leviathan or guide her towards some missing truth, the protagonist walks alongside her, and in doing so is forced to confront their own fears about identity and expectation. Neither of them is defined by what they've lost, neither of them is treated as incomplete, and that's what makes their dynamic work. Leviathan ends up feeling far more human than I ever expected, from her fondness for ice cream to being a bit of an airhead at times, to moments that are just straight up funny, like casually incinerating the base's pool because someone asked her to. I think it was Chen. It was Chen, wasn't it? Those small, almost throwaway details matter. They stop Leviathan from feeling like a concept or a trope and instead make her feel like an actual person living in this world, and paired with the protagonist's quieter, more introspective development, that's what really makes this story land. By the time Leviathan's story ended, what struck me most wasn't any single moment or reveal. It was the feeling that I just experienced something very different from what I expected, and different in a genuinely good way. Going in, I was prepared for something heavier, more dramatic, more focused on loss, identity, and the idea that missing memories had to be recovered in order for the story to feel complete. And instead, what I got was something much quieter and much more human. Leviathan isn't compelling because of tragedy or mystery, she's compelling because she's allowed to be a person first, someone who reacts, adapts, and makes a choice that isn't framed as heroic or devastating, but simply right for her. That restraint is what made the story work for me. It didn't try to force emotional weight through escalation or spectacle. It trusts the characters, their insecurities, their choices, and their small moments to carry the experience. And in a genre and a game that often leans towards bigger stakes and louder storytelling, that kind of approach feels refreshing, not because it's subtle for the sake of being subtle, but because it feels honest about what it wants to be. Leviathan ended up being a far more human character than I expected, and the story surrounding her respected that humanity instead of overwhelming it, and that's ultimately why this character story stuck with me. It didn't try to surprise me with twists, it just told the simple story well, and sometimes that's more than enough. If you enjoy this kind of slower, more character-focused analysis, feel free to leave a like, it really helps the video reach the people who might be interested in it. And if you want more videos like this, looking at storytelling, characters, and patterns across gacha games and serialized fiction, consider subscribing. That's basically what I do here. I'm genuinely curious what other people thought about Leviathan's story, especially if you had a very different read on it. So if you want to share your thoughts, feel free to leave a comment. And if this worked for you, there should be another video on the screen right now. You might find this one interesting as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.